All right, awesome. Yeah, whenever you want to start. Oh, do we want to not introduce everybody, but just like.
Yeah, so the debaters on the negative side of the topic, and this will be on the November-December public forum topic on nuclear no first use. And it'll be John Nahas and as a first speaker and Conrad Pelor as the second speaker. And then on the affirmative side, speaking second, it will be Alec Bolton speaking first, and then Siva Sivan speaking second.
Cool. So if everybody is good, I'll just get us started here. Great. Let's begin. Because US deterrence has been the linchpin of global peace since the Cold War, we negate. Contention 1 is Japanese proliferation. Following World War II, Japan agreed not to acquire nuclear weapons in exchange for US security commitments. The Japan Times explains on August 29th that Japan is committed to upholding the security relationship with the US, despite the resignation of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and that this relationship will continue irrespective of who wins the US election. Consequently, Yukio explains in 2009 that Japan's commitment to non-proliferation relies entirely on the credibility of US defense commitments in the sense that they need to be assured that if an adversary such as China or North Korea attacks them, the US will retaliate. Consequently, Keith Payne explains in 2016 that a US adoption of NFU would mean that we could no longer assure our allies with our nuclear umbrella, meaning allies like Japan will take matters into their own hands and seek nukes. Unfortunately, Simbiala in 2015 explains that the acquisition of nukes by Japan would drastically increase the probability of war in East Asia as it causes a regional security dilemma, which is heightened due to the close proximity and short flight time of ballistic missiles, which could result in existential catastrophes. Contention 2 is Russia. NATO's Article 5 declares that an attack on one is an attack on all, which is why Friedman in 2016 finds that unconditional support of collective defense is at the bedrock of NATO. Despite Trump's past rocky rhetoric, NATO has remained resilient, as Austin reports just months ago that NATO has seen its strongest reinforcement in troop commitments since the Cold War. To no surprise, adoption of no first use would rupture this trend, as Payne 16 finds that it would signal to adversaries that they can strike our allies without fearing US nuclear deterrent, greenlighting escalation. There are two impacts, and the first of which is Russian aggression. Gray notes that Putin in particular will test red lines and miscalculate with signs of NATO fracturing, and that his current military strategy is heavily dependent on the coercive use of nukes. In fact, Nazi OS 18 explains that Putin is revisionist in nature and seeks to expand Russia's sphere of influence, an endeavor which Porter 19 finds could result in the use of nuclear use against military targets. Second is European proliferation. Lanzaneko 18 explains that unilateral doctrine announcements spark abandonment fears in allies, which guarantees nuclear proliferation. Acts 18 continues that with the loss of US deterrence capabilities under Article 5, France and the United Kingdom would expand their nuclear capabilities, and non-nuclear countries such as Germany would seek development of their own nuclear programs. The result is a security dilemma that drastically increases the probability of war. Our third and final contention is Chinese containment. China is pursuing a revisionist foreign policy. As Davidson explains in 2016, that China's foreign policy has shifted in 2008 when they were pursuing both an aggressive and expansionist foreign policy that heightens the risk of war with the United States. Chinese expansionism means that engagement is over and deterrence is necessary. Mearsheimer explains in 2016 that China is growing to the US pivot to Asia, which was committed, it needs to be committed to containing China and deterring expansionism. Unfortunately, the adoption of no first use would deck the US commitment to deter Chinese expansion. As Kalaki explains in 2016, that the reason Obama rejected NFU is because it would signal acquiescence and appeasement in the face of Chinese expansion, increasing the probability of aggression. In fact, The Guardian in 2008 finds that the threat of a nuclear first strike is key to US power projection abroad and key to containment politics. Historically, Yukio of MIT in 2015 finds that policies that appease China cause Chinese aggression. In Vietnam, US withdrawal of military presence led to China seizing the Parcel Islands, and withdrawal from the Philippines caused Chinese annexation of the Mischief Reef. The impact is a great power war. As Simbiala finds in 2020, that Chinese expansionism and nuclear modernization drastically heightens the odds of nuclear war in East Asia. Multiple scenarios for nuclear war, such as miscalculation at regional hotspots, would potentially escalate into a full-on nuclear war. Cumulatively, Starr finds in 2014 that any nuclear war would cause the extinction because radiation, which poisons biospheres, would kill plants and animals. The fallout would accelerate climate change and block sun rays, and meltdowns of nuclear reactors would cause radioactive isotope leakage. Because no first use undermines global peace, Conrad and I have never been more proud to negate. Thank you.
Okay, everyone ready? We affirm contention one is assuring India. Right now, India and Pakistan are on a path to an inevitable conflict. Dr. Amar Singh, 18 of the IDR, explains that the India-Pakistani dispute over Kashmir is intertwined with decades of ethno-nationalist tensions, with both sides believing the other is unwilling to surrender. Efforts to reconcile differences have only bounced back much later, much worse, with growing mistrust making war inevitable. However, such a conflict will remain limited. Sharma 19 explains that Pakistan is scared of a nuclear conflict. Even if they use the entirety of their nuclear arsenal, India would survive, while India could use limited nuclear strikes to target specific Pakistani corridors that crash their economy and leave them obliterated. Luckily, Krugman 16 writes that India has adopted their own NFU, meaning Pakistan believes they will not engage in nuclear retaliation if Pakistan does not first. This does not prevent conventional conflict, but rather exacerbates it, as Krugman furthers that this dichotomy means that both sides are still willing to engage in conventional conflict despite being nuclearly armed. India's NFU, the last chance at preventing nuclear escalation, is sadly at risk. Beno writes in September that India has begun to internally abandon its NFU policy despite public adherence to it, with military officials implying that India would launch a nuclear preemptive strike against Pakistan if needed. Furthermore, India abandoning its NFU risks severe mistrust between the two nations, triggering a nuclear arms race that leads to accidental and unauthorized nuclear launches. Voting affirmative is critical. India needs a superpower ally to reaffirm their own commitments, and the U.S. is key. Tanner 119 writes that India's abandonment of their NFU comes from a belief that they are excluded from the global nuclear order, with a U.S. NFU policy reaffirming their commitment to their own NFU. Conventional conflict cannot escalate to nuclear retaliation, as Dr. Jeff Myers 19 quantifies that an Indian-Pakistani nuclear conflict will lead to global famine and drought due to a mini nuclear winter, sparking resource conflicts and allowing diseases to spread, overall killing 2 billion people in the short term. Contention 2 is peace on the peninsula. Efforts to reconcile differences with North Korea have been a train wreck. Chang 19 of the Southwestern Law School writes that denuclearization meetings between the Trump administration and North Korea have deadlocked. The U.S. continues to expect North Korea to make the first move, despite the fact that North Korea needs some indication that the U.S. will not strike North Korea if they denuclearize. Luckily, Chang concludes that if the U.S. adopted an NFU, it would send a signal of peace to North Korea, encourage them to denuclearize, and allowing talks to continue, allowing us to take the first step for them to take the second. There are 4 impacts to denuclearization. First is removing sanctions. Gray 19 finds that North Korea has been sanctioned by the international community in a failed attempt to pressure them to denuclearize. They have reduced trade by over 80%, turning a previous 3% growth rate to a negative 4%. This has decimated the development of North Korea's agricultural industry, and now the UN 19 finds that 10 million North Koreans are on the brink of starvation. Second is calming South Korea. Hilbert 18 writes that continued nuclearization of North Korea boosts South Korean domestic calls for nuclearization as a form of defense due to American diplomatic failure. Such an event would then push countries such as Japan and Taiwan to follow suit in fear of neighboring nuclear conflict, triggering a regional arms race that risks nuclear war as states miscalculate their neighbors' intent in proliferating. Third is clearing the waters. Bender 18 explains that a nuclear North Korea without an established peace deal will lead to nuclear conflict with the U.S. Due to constant tension and heightened fear and mistrust, any small situation is at high risk of being miscalculated as the beginning of war. With North Korea attempting U.S. ships in an attempt to deter the U.S., there is a growing probability that the U.S. will respond aggressively. But fourth is saving the NPT. Hilbert analyzes that even the appearance of accepting North Korea as a nuclear state would destroy the fundamental basis for the NPT, a treaty founded on global denuclearization. It would show the rest of the world that there are lower damages if they proliferate in the way North Korea did. Code 15 concludes that should the NPT collapse, there will be a snowball effect where simply one state violating it triggers global nuclearization at once, and Figure 15 furthers that this would inevitably lead to mass hysteria amongst nuclear rising states, with irrational actors miscalculated, launching nukes, pushing the world into a global nuclear war. Thus, we're incredibly proud to affirm. You can have the first question in Cross, by the way.
Oh, before we get there, Conrad, do you want to take any prep? You're good? Okay, cool. So as you said, let's start Cross. So I want to talk a little bit about your India scenario. You say that India feels excluded by the international community, and that's why they're being aggressive?
Well, particularly when it comes to the nuclear world order. So I'm going to
take right. So if India feels excluded relative to the nuclear world order, why does the U.S. having a policy change the way that India feels? Because just the U.S. has a no first use doesn't mean that India feels like it would be in their strategic benefit to do the same.
Well, yes, because we can both agree that the reason India is abandoning their NFU is because they believe they're isolated. So if
No, the
US
reason
destroys
why
them,
they're
they're not
banning their
isolated,
NFU,
why
which is
would
what
they
you
no
yourself
longer
told me
ban?
in case, was because India feels like the NFU is constraining in the conflict with Pakistan. We both acknowledge that there's alternative reasons for banning the NFU. That's how the US fits into the picture.
There may be alternative reasons for abandoning the NFU, but we'd argue that there are a ton of other things that India can do in order to ensure their own domestic
Does you
stability.
report that India will launch a nuclear strike in the status quo?
Well, there are possibilities that they launch a nuclear strike in the event of a
Let's
conventional
pretend I'm Prime Minister Modi. How would that be in my best interest to launch a nuclear strike?
You can end the war
Walk me through the
quickly.
reasoning. Sorry?
End the war quickly.
I would end the war quickly. So would I not face international retaliation for launching a nuke and killing millions? Do you think the international community would look at that lightly?
Yeah, but I'd argue that first of all, they probably care a hell of a lot less what the international community thinks than what their own domestic population thinks
That's
when
really
it comes to taking over
interesting because what you
Kashmir.
told me 5
Second, more
seconds ago
importantly,
was that
why
India
doesn't
was
that
a
apply to
security
your?
ally.
Why doesn't that analysis apply to every single one of your contentions?
This is
Japan
super
probably
important.
cares.
I
about
really
the
want to clarify
community
this.
thinks.
So
Wouldn't
your
Russia and
point,
China as well?
Alec, let's have a back and forth here. So your point was that
Do you
India
want a back and
cares
forth
about the
answer
international
question?
community, which is why they're not committed to the NPT. Then seconds later, you said they don't care about the international community and they only care about national security threats. There's a massive contradiction. Which is it? Do they
No.
care or do they not?
I'd argue they don't care insofar as they're excluded from it. That's the thesis of my
But
case.
you just
So
said
here, you can switch around and deal with India all you want, but you can't dodge the biggest question. Why doesn't that piece of analysis apply to your entire case?
how would it?
Tell me that Japan cares about their security commitments to the United States. So at that point, why would they throw them away with the entirety of the rest of the world?
It's that Japan cares about the U.S.'s security commitment to them.
Okay, so what happened in 2010 when the U.S. began discussions with an NFU with Japan?
A lot of things happened in 2010, and what happened in 2017 is similar in that the U.S. assured Japan that North Korea would not.
What happened in 2010 when we talked with Japan about an NFU?
I mean, plenty of
206 Japanese legislators came out and asked us to do it, and their leader at the time, the leader of the Japanese Democratic Party, asked us to do it as well. So what's so radically different from Japan now and Japan 10 years ago?
Exactly. Japan in 2010 had a different security apparatus. Since
What was different
2010,
about it?
you skip all of 2017.
What was different about it?
Yeah,
Their
I'm
security apparatus has been the same since the end of World War II.
Right. I'd love to explain. So you skip all of 2017, which is that the Korean Peninsula saw the most tension it ever saw. Japan doubled down on their need for the
We had
U.S.
a
to have.
Korean War one time, so I'm pretty sure it's not been more than
U.S.
that.
imposes an NFU, they'll likely nuclearize if they feel like the U.S. isn't there to deter.
Look, we've had worse conflicts in 2017.
All right. I think I'm going to take some prep time. So let me pull up my timer. Okay. So as a bit of an overview, it's going to start with an overview. You can probably flow it on the affirmative case, and then it'll just be down the negative case, or down the affirmative case, starting with the negative case. You can flow it on the negative case. Okay. Let's begin. The most important impact scenario in the round is when a state first acquires a nuclear weapon. This is true for two reasons. First, Matthew Kroenig of Georgetown University explains that when a state first acquires a nuclear weapon, they lack second strike capabilities in the sense that they don't have a big nuclear arsenal, which means they might preemptively launch a nuclear strike out of the fear that the nuclear capacity would be taken out by an enemy strike. Similarly, another country is likely to launch at a new nuclear state to neutralize the threat with no fear of nuclear retaliation. This independently outweighs both of their scenarios because their states already have developed nuclear programs, which means that they have second strike capabilities. But secondly, on time frame, Keck explains in 2014 that if Japan, because of the excess plutonium that exists within Japan proper, they could acquire nuclear weapons in the matter of months. At that point, it significantly outweighs the point where there is no war in the status quo. But now let's go to my opponent's first contention, where they talk about war with Iran or in India. So on uniqueness, war between India and Pakistan will never happen, contrary to what my opponent talks about. First, global pressure. Kelly 19 analyzes that there is global pressure from the European Union, Australia, France, and the UN Security Council to relieve tensions between India and Pakistan to prevent conflict. Second, domestic limitations. Tisdall 19 explains Pakistani's Khan won't fight because he is still getting started after winning power for the first time in July 2018. India's Modi won't fight because he is seeking re-election. Third, Indian power. Even if India is weak, Tisdall finds that Pakistan won't be able to win a war against India due to differences in military power and wealth, and thus won't start a war. Tellus 17 furthers that the risk of a decisive Indian military victory prevents Pakistan from starting conflict by only taking small risk. And lastly, China. Sawani 19 analyzes that an Indo-Pak India-Pakistan war would quickly bring in Pakistani's biggest ally, China, risking a regional war of 3 nuclear armed states. India would be further deterred consistently. They share another border with China. Next turn, they cause alienation with China. They say the United States fills in. This directly it escalates tensions with China in the region as they fight over the United States. The next response is that their link is not unique. India has reaffirmed its policy of no first use of nuclear weapon 3 weeks ago. Their evidence is from September. Our evidence is from October 3rd. And Elizabeth Roche explains is that in light of the conflict with China, India has reaffirmed its commitment to no first use of nuclear weapons. There's no reason why the United States is necessarily key. Additionally, de-link their argument. Ted Race explains in 2009 that India is a realist actor that has legitimate security concerns. This points to the contradiction that John was making. They either care about international pressure or not. We contend that India is particularly a realist state, and they care and they model due to security concerns, and they believe that no first use is key to their deterrence or that first use is key to their deterrence capability with Pakistan, which means no first use is key to their deterrence capabilities, and particularly so that Pakistan won't attack them, and it's key to resolving concerns around miscalculation. But then go to their second contention where they talk about war with North Korea. First, there's a first strike is very unlikely. Everett of CNN explains in 2017 that because North Korea now has the ability to strike the United States with a nuclear-equipped ICBM, the U.S. will never risk a first strike. He concludes that as more time progresses, a U.S. strike will become less and less likely. Second, China will always check back the possibility of a U.S. strike. Kordsman of the CSIS explains in 2013 that the U.S. is significantly limited in talking about, let alone acting on the possibility of a preemptive strike. But then on their argument about negotiations, first turn, Oslin writes in 2017 that negotiations with North Korea have failed for over the past century, and that will probably never change. It's because North Korea uses negotiations to prop up the Kim regime. Hecker of Stanford University in 2010 observes that North Korea's participation in the six-party talks was used as a distraction to prevent military intervention and increase access to resources while they build up their nuclear weapons. Next turn, this causes alienation with South Korea and causes them to acquire a nuclear weapon. This was warranted further by the pain evidence we read on case that our allies would likely acquire a nuclear weapon, which drastically increases the probability of war in the Korean Peninsula, as South Korea no longer has the fear of the United States, i.e. that if North Korea attacks South Korea, the United States would no longer be able to provide them under the realm of the nuclear umbrella, which means North Korea is more likely to operate and South Korea is more likely to take defense into their own hands.
Siva, do you want to call for like?
So it's going to start responding to the overview that they read at the top of our case, and then it's going to turns on C1, frontline C2, then we'll go to their case, and then I'll signpost, but I'm going to be handling the China debate at the top, and then handling Japan. Actually, no, don't worry about it. It'll just be straight down their case.
Siva, just for me to clarify, it'll just be overview, then top down your case, top down mine, right?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Is everybody good? Okay. On the overview, norms solve back per our argument on the impact level of our C2. If the NPT is reaffirmed, that means the U.S. setting a norm of denuclearization is the best risk of solving back for their scenario on a larger scope. Second, the impact disproves the link. Countries have acquired nukes, but we haven't seen anybody first strike out of fear of losing their nuclear capabilities. And third, we would say incentive calculus matters more. Even if states are in a use it or lose it scenario, they need somebody to actually strike. So if we solve for the incentive, it's a far cleaner link. Finally, these are all just links into nuclear war. They're just saying it's a way prolif can lead to nuclear war. It's not comparative with our links. We'll do weighing on that in the back half. On the turn, on our first contention about China filling in, A, there's no warrant as to why China fill in would cause war. B, India reaffirming the NFU, which is a conceded link on our case, solves back. And C, we're going to read turns to China on their case, which will probably outweigh these. Now, on our second contention, they read a response that North Korea has failed over the past century for negotiations. There is conceded uniqueness on our North Korea argument that North Korea is nuclearizing right now because Trump failed to compromise in negotiations, non-unique in the entirety of this argument and the turn. This has two implications. First, it non-uniques the entirety of their argument and means we're the only risk of solvency. But second, North Korea prolif pushes South Korea, China, Japan, Taiwan to nuclearize, causing a chain reaction, risking all-out nuclear war, probably on a larger scope. Our evidence is A, more recent, and B, gives the causality that because Trump has failed to compromise, that is why North Korea is continuing. We are the more recent, historical precedent on the evidence. Then they say South Korea is going to take defense in their own hand. One, there's no response to the idea that North Korea is nuclearizing right now, which non-uniques the turn, links back into our solvency on the overview. But second, South Korea doesn't believe that the NFU is key. We have the largest military base of the U.S. in the world on the Japanese coast right next to South Korea. The evidence that we'll read on their case disproves this argument. Let's go to their case. At the top, my opponent's case entirely rests on the fact that the idea of the NFU would undermine commitments to allies. However, a no first use policy would be paired with an increase in our defensive capabilities. Two warrants. A is assurance. Virgin 19 explains that historically, to assure our allies are still protected, the U.S. increases missile defense systems for protection. But second is deterrence. Without the threat of nuclear strikes to deter conventional conflict, the U.S. would need another way to deter enemies, which is through BMDs. These missile defense systems, or BMDs, are key for two reasons, both turns. First is interception. Davis 01 explains that BMDs intercept missiles 99% of the time, and Daewoo concludes that each intercepted missile directly saves 300,000 lives. And second is allied proliferation. Einhorn 19 of Brookings finds that through cooperation with Russia and China, Iran is the fastest growing offensive missile system in the entire region. Absent support, our allies would prefer offensive deterrents like nuclear weapons, which link turns their case. But third is diplomacy. The MDR 19 explains that the threat of a failed attack enforces our diplomatic efforts in the region, which enables us to negotiate with actors that aren't as friendly. On their case, top shelf. First, Marchetti 17 explains that through the trends of the Bush and Obama administration proved that hegemonic decline is inevitable due to overwhelming management costs. Meanwhile, China is rising fast to combat U.S. hegemonic control. We can either go down fast and peacefully or have a slow and violent transition. And Swain 15 confirms that China is willing to engage with the U.S. to embrace multipolarity, but U.S. dominance forces China to adopt a hard-edged approach, which directly responds to the China contention. For example, Preston 18 explains that to combat U.S. hegemony, China has turned towards space militarization to get ahead, and O'Connor 19 furthers that U.S. hegemonic decline, U.S. hegemonic military presence has pushed Russia to join China in cooperative space operations. Gillard 18 analyzes that space militarization would cause space debris in the cloud to orbit, rendering satellites and militaries ineffective for many states, establishing a clear power imbalance that sparks mass proliferation and war. Second, there's no unique reasons why allies would not be comfortable with conventional U.S. responses versus a nuclear response. If we win the BMD link level, that means that the U.S. still supports our allies. There's no warranting done as to why nuclear strikes are key. On Japan, first, Blair 16 finds that the threat of allies proliferating in response to NFU is not credible. Military data shows that our top 30 allies don't see our first use policy as a critical defense element, especially given the conventional, biological, and chemical warfare capacity of the U.S. But on Russia, two responses. First, our conventional military still checks. Once again, we have military bases in the region, and there's no reason why nukes are key. Second, NATO also checks. Mod 19 explains that nuclear weapons are a key part of NATO's arsenal, which means that Russia would still be deterred, independent of Article 5. And third, you turn it because Arbatov 17 explains that U.S. pressure on China risks nuclear war. U.S. pressure on Russia risks nuclear war because Russia depicts a nightmare scenario where the U.S. nuclear strikes first, and given their limited conventional capacity, they're growing and more willing to preemptively use nuclear weapons to deter the U.S. On China, first, nuclear deterrence doesn't check. Green 19 finds that China would attempt to evade a nuclear fight by using cyber weapons and space weapons, both of which would result in U.S. nuclear response. And second, you turn it because Zhang 16 finds that U.S. military hegemony over China confirms hardline reviews that the U.S. wants to contain China, undermining moderate positions within China's domestic debate. And Swain 15 confirms that this is the only risk to actually commit peace between China and the U.S. Alrighty, Conrad, whenever you're ready.
Okay. So let me start on the second contention. So the second warrant as to why you say the North Korea scenario outweighs is that North Korean nuclearization causes a chain reaction and causes other states in the region to acquire nuclear weapons. When has this happened? And like what state?
Well, I mean, lots of states are attempting to acquire nuclear weapons.
Like which state?
We can give you evidence that South Korea is trying to right now.
Okay, I'd like to see that because I would say that since the inception of the NPT and other things like that, no state has really acquired a nuclear weapon with the exception of Israel in the past.
I'm not saying South Korea hasn't right now. I'm saying they're attempting to and they're developing capacity to. But independent of that, I think you're missing like the point of our argument. Our argument is that North Korea is one of the most irrational actors in the region and one of the ones that they're most scared about, which means that if your overview is true, that says preventing people from acquiring nukes is the most important thing, we would say solving back for North Korea is probably the cleanest link into doing that.
So my question then is like, what evidence did you read in rebuttal that says that South Korea is actually attempting to acquire nuclear weapons right now, right? Like you
want to make that response, we can read evidence to frontline it, but independent of that, I think once again you're missing like the nuance of our argument. It's not about South Korea, it's not about any other state. It's that North Korea, hands down, is the most irrational actor in the region, which is why solving for the incentive, like from a North Korea perspective, is a lot more important than like whichever way you.
What's your question?
Yeah. Okay. So my curiosity is why exactly is a U.S. nuclear response more important than a conventional response?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this. I think that the nuclear umbrella is key to U.S. deterrence capabilities. So, for example, John mentioned like in 2017. Let's look what happened in 2017. North Korea shot a ICBM into the Sea of Japan. I would say that in a world in which the United States did not have a nuclear umbrella, right? Japan is going to likely take security into their own hands because Japan could be nuked by North Korea with no retaliation. Like what no force use does is it prevents
So
the United
I
States.
think that you're misunderstanding my question. My question isn't like, why is it key that we have a retaliation? My question is, why is it key that that retaliation is nuclear and not conventional?
Yeah, so if Japan gets nuked, let's say by North Korea, like a conventional warfare, that's not enough for like deterrence capabilities. Like Japan's not going to be assured that like, oh, if North Korea
Yeah,
nukes
you're
us,
saying it's not enough, but you're not giving me a reason why it's not enough, right? If we
a
conventionally
nuclear,
invade North Korea,
a
why is that
nuclear
not enough?
war causes complete destruction of an entire country, and a conventional war has like no effect because it would result in not as many casualties, right? So it's like it's not like
Okay, so that's
what happened in Japan.
if it's
Right?
about
Like in World
casualties,
War
North
II,
Korea, right? That
as soon as the
first
nuclear
relies on the
weapon was
assumption that
used,
North Korea cares about the number of casualties of their
in
people.
World War II, as soon as a nuclear weapon was used, the war ended, right? Because states fear the total destruction that is caused by a nuclear war. So our argument is that
Okay.
is key to deterrence capability.
Okay, and you have evidence that says it's uniquely about nucler weapons, like
Yeah.
the difference that it
We
causes.
read multiple cards in case. So we specifically specify the Yukio card that the non-proliferation regime is based on U.S. nuclear deterrence and the nuclear umbrella, and the Pain 16 evidence also was.
Yeah, but I don't think any of those are specifically comparative to the idea that we could still like respond conventionally. I think there's 20 seconds left. Do you want another question?
That's all right.
Okay, great. So the order is going to be it's going to be a little bit jumpy. So it's going to start off with generally what's going on right now, a little discussion on ballistic missile defense. Then I'm going to be discussing your case, then my case. Is everyone good? Great. If everyone's good, let's begin the time now. Conrad and I argue that nuclear deterrence is the only thing that matters. It's worked for the past 50 years, which means uniqueness is on our side. There is no war right now. Don't fix it if it isn't broken. They try to attribute this to ballistic missile defense, saying that's the reason it's been successful. But there's a couple of issues. First, ballistic missile defense doesn't ensure our allies because A, it could be circumvented with decoys or nuclear submarines that go around the ballistic missile defense. But second, it doesn't offer our allies assurances and flexibility from a diplomatic standpoint. So it's insufficient, only nuclear deterrence checks. But two turns. They say ballistic missile defense goes up. We say this is bad. Grego 13 finds that ballistic missile defense would embolden our allies to take first strikes because now they feel slightly more reassured, which means that military adventurism goes up and war in the Korean Peninsula also increases. But second, it would also increase scapegoating, as Bullock finds that China would use ballistic missile defense as a scapegoat to get out of diplomatic negotiations, which are key to denuclearizing North Korea. We would say that China is the best link into this because China controls 90% of North Korea's oil, and we say that China is the only one that stopped them back in 2003. With that, let's go to their case. On their first point on India, they drop a couple of things. First, Modi would never launch a strike because he's worried about the elections, and Pakistan is too scared to do the same, which means that we know that no India war would happen. India cares too much about their international image to start a war. So at that point, you're not voting on their first argument. Let's talk about the only argument they have left in the round, which is their second argument about North Korea, because Siva mishandles this as well. The first thing that he mishandles is that talks have always failed. That's what you have to remember. The last time we had talks with North Korea, they just used that to buy time, build up their arsenal, which means that diplomacy can't work, only deterrence can. But second, what the CNN evidence, which they never respond to, finds is that North Korea would never launch a strike because they know the US would never preemptively strike them. There's mutually assured destruction because North Korea has ICBMs and a second strike capability, which means that North Korea would never launch an attack on the US. It's only the regional allies that matter. Finally, they try to make this argument that regional proliferation is happening right now and NPT reassurance is key. They never read one iota of evidence to suggest that there's regional proliferation right now. And they also never read an iota of evidence to suggest that the NPT would be reaffirmed by some sort of no first use policy. At that point, let's go to our side of the flow. Quickly on Russia, we agree that NATO checks back against Russia, which means it's not a concern in today's round. Let's go to the China scenario, though, because this is where they read the most responses. First, they say that hardliners are going to get emboldened. They say that China's hegemony is going up. This is a reason to vote for us. Conrad explains very clearly that China is revisionist. They will change in opposition to US moves. And we say that the US counterbalances China with deterrence, and we shift away from the 2016 strategy of the Asian pivot. China will be contained. In fact, the Kalaki evidence from case, which they don't respond to, says that a no first use policy was not pursued by Obama because it would appease hardliners and increase the probability of aggression. That's why we say that Chinese hegemony can only be checked back for with a first strike option. And we find that the last time the US pulled out of the region, China invaded Vietnam, they invaded the Philippines. So the only way to check back against China, contain them, and make sure they work with us to stop North Korea is with a credible nuclear deterrent. We've had peace for the last 50 years and we want to keep it that way, which is why we proudly negate. Thank you.
Yo, everyone ready? So it's going to go the negative case and then the affirmative case.
Cool.
Everyone ready? Okay. You can start off on my opponent's case. This round's basically over. You go to BMDs, group together all of their turns. There are black and white issues that exist if BMDs are there or BMDs are not there. We tell you that BMDs literally already exist. So there's already a reason our allies are involved and China can scapegoat them already. The only impact that comes off of this is the scalar impact about making BMDs more or less effective. So you can extend our analysis that the US uses BMDs in order to reassure our allies and that BMDs are critical because every missile that's intercepted saves over 300,000 lives. You can literally pull trigger here because John doesn't extend an impact other than the invasion of Vietnam. That means nothing considering the last invasion only kills 50,000 people. I've got 2.5 minutes left and you can already sign your ballot. But you know what? There are two independent pieces of offense on their case that lose them the round. First is the Marchetti turn, which John fully concedes, which says the U.S. hegemonic decline is inevitable. The management costs are way too high, and they themselves tell you that the trends of the Bush and Obama administration prove this. That means that first of all, China is inevitably going to become appeased, and they're going to expand no matter what. But second, and more importantly, it means that we can make a choice. We can either go down slow and peaceful. We can either go down slow and violently, which is what we're doing right now, or we can do it fast and peacefully by adopting an NFU. They fully concede the precedent and O'Connor evidence that clearly indicate that China and Russia are responding to U.S. military pressure by militarizing space, which is leading to massive amounts of space debris, which cloud the orbit, render satellites ineffective, and lead to massive amounts of proliferation and nuclear war. At that point, nuclear war outweighs every other argument in the round because the, quote, invasion of Vietnam, in John's own words, is unquantified, uncontextualized, and definitely doesn't lead to, according to them, the nuclear war, which causes a nuclear winter and causes extinction. You can sign your ballot literally right now. But the second place where you can sign your ballot on their case is on the hardliner turns. They tell you that China is revisionist and that the U.S. is critical to prevent appeasement, but they drop the analysis we made in rebuttal. China's not revisionist, it's hardliners. They cold concede the swaying evidence that China has historically been willing to cooperate with the United States, but it's only when we use military pressure that they're forced to adopt revisionist powers as a way of deterring the United States. Ask this question reasonably. If we're not putting a gun to their head, why do they need to put a gun to ours? The moment we pull out, you allow China to adopt more peaceful measures which prevent nuclear escalation and prevents all of the impacts that they talk about. So at that point, the only other area where you can sign your ballot, even though the round's basically over, is on this argument about North Korea. Group together the first two arguments talking about how North Korea won't launch a strike and about China. This is about the U.S. striking North Korea, which does not relate to our argument about North Korean nuclearization causing global proliferation. They tell you that talks fail, but they can see the analysis. The reason talks failed and the reason North Korea used them to bolster their regime is because the U.S. was not willing to give anything up. If you adopt NFU, it sends a signal of goodwill to North Korea that we're willing to cooperate with them. At that point, North Korea denuclearizes, which prevents the erosion of the NPT, which is the only thing that right now is preventing massive nuclear proliferation. They tell you that there's no evidence and it's not happening right now. Group together both of them. We tell you it's going to happen in the future. You can call for the evidence if you want. At that point, nuclear proliferation, according to them, is the only thing that will actually lead to states without second strike capabilities using their nuclear weapons first in fear of being struck back, causing massive amounts of nuclear war. That's the third conceded link into nuclear war.
Just to clarify on the BMD argument, what was the evidence that was read that says is that the way in which the United States assures our allies is through BMDs in a world in which we don't assure them with nuclear umbrella, we will all of a sudden do that with ballistic missile defense.
We read this like Virgin evidence that says that that's how we've assured our allies historically is through an increase in BMDs. It's not specific to the no first use policy, but
okay. Would you like a question?
Oh yeah, sure. So Alec, do you have a question?
I'd be happy to take one.
Yeah.
Is that cool? Okay, great.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this whole space militarization.
Well, John, the way Grand Cross works is that we don't talk about arguments that were conceded. So if you want to talk about an argument that you
arguments that responded to and arguments that you didn't adequately frontline. So let's start there. When did China start militarizing space?
So there was absolutely no response. So I'm not going to entertain this.
Do you not know the answer? I mean, I think for the sake of education, I'd just like to understand when China started militarizing space.
I think like a few years ago or something.
It was 2016. What happened in 2016? What happened
And
in 20?
it'll all be new analysis once again. All right, we're going to take a question now.
Explain
So-
what the speech
Wait,
if you
hold
heard
up. I don't think they started militarizing in 2016. I think you're asserting that because you have this other argument about Obama's shift in 2016.
Well, that's exactly the case. China started militarizing space after the Asian pivot policy. That was in my summary, and that responds to literally all of your analysis. Because I say the only time where Russia and China are aggressive is when the U.S. has a hands-off approach. Because they were reviewing.
There's
Yeah,
evidence
okay,
in
sure.
2010
I
that
think
China is
John, you're
pursuing space
conflating the two arguments that we're going forward. You're
Which one of
conflating
you
the two
wants
arguments
to-
that you
which one of you wants to talk?
Yeah, sure. You're conflating the two arguments that are going for. One is the idea that moderates can take power in China. That is the unique reason that it changes in
Moderates? I
the
thought your argument was about hardliners. First it was about moderates, now it's about. I'm
So
confused.
hardliners are the opposites of sorry,
understand.
hardliners are the
So
opposites
what's
of
your
moderate.
argument?
So when hardliners like no longer have power, the moderates take power and are able to
Right.
be like a more
So what's your
common.
argument about
That's
hardliners?
the argument. It's the same the entire round. Independent of that, the other argument that you're conflating it with is the overall macro argument that says that right now.
What's your hardliners argument?
Our hardliners' argument is that when we use military dominance to try to force China into submission, then hardliners gain power because they can campaign off of the idea that the U.S. is attempting to contain them. But also, there's evidence that China began space militarization as far back as 2010.
So you just made a statement. I'm going to respond. You said that hardliners are going to campaign off of the premise that the U.S. is militarizing. It seems a lot more feasible to me that hardliners gain legitimacy when the U.S. steps off. That's viewed as a sign of U.S. weakness, and hardliners can campaign and say China's the best country in the world. Our national.
John, that's fine. What's the argument you're going for in this round?
No, the issue is both moderates and hardliners can campaign off of that. Moderates can't campaign off of U.S. containment.
Yeah, that's fine. Wait, John, real quick.
Our argument precisely is that these hardliners are more legitimized when the U.S. takes a hands-off approach. Because when the U.S. has a hands-on approach, then the cost of doing the political
Okay,
incursions.
well, that's just not true.
Goes
The
up.
US
That's foreign policy 101. We
No,
saw that in
no,
2016.
no, there's different ideas in foreign policy, and what we would contend is that what's historically supported is the idea that when the U.S. is more contained or pursues a policy of containment towards China, that is when hardliners gain power. Now, really quickly,
You're entitled to your own feelings, but not your own facts. In 2016, when the U.S. took a
Okay,
hands-on.
still down there. Okay, we both know where that's.
I've not read any evidence, John, about that. So if you want to do that new and final focus, that's fine. Out of curiosity, can I please get one question in Grand Cross?
Yeah, absolutely.
What impact scenario are you going for?
There's plenty. We just say that war in like as a whole is a bad thing, and that we reduce the risk of tension in war.
Okay, so which
Okay, wait,
country,
what kind of war?
where, how, what kind of war?
Okay, there's plenty. So one is like Chinese
No,
invasion.
one you extended in summary.
Sorry.
Which one specifically do you extend in summary?
Okay, so I extend that China war happens. I say that the people in the Korean Peninsula, like our allies, have a first strike. That causes nuclear war. I say that North Korea could start a nuclear war. All of the arguments are about war on both sides, right? So we're saying that we reduce the probability of war in Asia generally, Southeast Asia, and that doesn't seem to be contested very well.
Okay, yeah, I think that's cross.
Great.
All right, is everyone ready? So it's going to start on the BMD argument, and then it'll go to the China argument, and then it'll go to North Korea at the bottom.
Really quickly, Conrad, did you check your messages?
No. Yeah, okay, I see it. Okay, so is everyone ready? Sorry, my screen. Starting their argument about ballistic missile defense, they're mishandling a couple of arguments that we made them. When I asked in CROSSFIRE, why are these countries adopting ballistic missile defense, is because they say it assures allies. However, the analysis made by John is that other things like submarines means that it doesn't fully assure our allies. So if we shift away from the nuclear umbrella, which was conceded throughout every speech is key to assuring our allies at a much larger scale, that increases military adventurism because allies no longer feel that they are assured, i.e. what happens when North Korea launches a submarine with a nuclear warhead. Ballistic missile defense isn't going to solve that, which is why it's a scalar impact. Also, their argument about how it saves lives is predicated off of them in a time of conflict. At the point in which they don't win any conflict scenario means you shouldn't evaluate this argument. It's predicated off them winning other arguments in the round. But China is the ultimate place where you should be voting for us. They make the argument that United States hegemony decline is inevitable. Okay, even if that is true, you should vote for us off of time frame because of the conceded analysis that China is a revisionist actor. They have not contested this claim, is that China historically is a realist actor that prioritizes expansionism and things like that. At that point, they dropped the Kalaki evidence that the no first use nuclear policy by the United States appeases China. And historically in the past, fact that causes Chinese expansionism in places like Vietnam and in the Philippines. So at the point in which the United States declines immediately as a result of no first use, China becomes aggressive, which magnifies their impact scenarios about space militarization and things like that, which means even if we don't read a turn or an impact, we're going for the same impact that you're going for. So we're just saying that they become more aggressive in your world. Last but not least, on the North Korea argument, they've read no impact specifically from the fact that nuclearization does not cause war, the conceded CNN evidence, but also perhaps more importantly than that, that talks backfired. Their argument about how, oh, the United States will be peaceful does not respond to the historical precedent example, is that the 6 party talks, that was the United States trying to be peaceful to North Korea, and it backfired and they actually became more aggressive. So at the point in which the status quo is no aggression, there is no war or no conflict, the only risk that conflict goes up is a world in which the United States loses its deterrence capabilities, which outweighs on time frame and immediacy as it's triggered immediately as you vote for the affirmative. So please, for that reason, I strongly urge a vote for the negative.
Are y'all good? John, Conrad, you here? Is John here?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. All right. It's gonna start on our North Korea's argument, North Korea argument, and then go to my opponent's case.
Cool.
All right. The only response that my opponents give to our North Korea argument is that historically talks have been peaceful and that has not done anything in terms of North Korea coming to the diplomatic negotiating table. This is not true. They completely concede our evidence that indicates that the reason why talks have not worked in the past is because the US has failed to give anything up. We say definitionally a no first use policy is giving something up and leveling the playing field. We are extending an olive branch that our evidence clearly explains will cause North Korea to denuclearize, setting a global norm. This outweighs A, because it's a global norm, but B, it completely links into our argument. All they say is that their arguments outweigh on time frame. No, the time frame is immediate in either world. It is a perception shift. Our argument simply is that North Korea only cares if the US is like attacking them or pursuing a containment power. Same with China, and we say that uniquely changes when the US extends an olive branch like a no first use policy. At that point, within clinging to our impact, they've conceded analysis that North Korea is the most irrational actor in the entire world. So obviously, getting them to denuclearize is the best way into solving any nuclear war. That is conceded analysis, which means we're the only risk of solving the best nuclear war in the debate. Let's go to their case. They really misunderstand our 2 arguments on China. The Marchetti evidence was completely conceded in John's summary. There was not a single piece of ink. You should feel very, very hesitant voting on any of the responses that Conrad gives, but I'll respond to them anyway. He says that this is the same argument as their argument about how China is like China containment. That's not true. Our arguments are 2 separate ones. The reason China is expanding in space right now is because they feel that they cannot counter US dominance on Earth. We say an NFU definitionally changes that, once again, because it's an olive branch that levels the playing field. They don't give you any comparative time frame analysis as to why it's important. We say the decline can be slow and violent, which is happening right now, or it can be fast and peaceful, which is what happens in our world. Take out their case, which is pretty simple. We say that we increase our defensive presence, which assures our allies that we have their back. Their only response is that submarines mean that we don't fully assure our allies. There's things that that mean nuclear weapons don't fully assure our allies. Like Alec points out, space can blind countries and mean that nuclear weapons aren't as effective, which means, obviously speaking, there are multiple ways. We say BMDs are still key to ensuring our allies that we have their back. That means that they garner no unique offense in our case. You can either vote for us on the North Korea argument or the Marchetti evidence that says that China decline is inevitable, and the best way to solve it is a slow, or fast and peaceful transition. All right, good debate, y'all.
Good round, y'all.